Hi there, this is Gianfranco Conti, and this is sort of an introduction to my CPD quickies, a series of very short um, talks that I'm going to give, monologues that I'm going to give on a few topics that in my conversations with teachers and in my exchanges on the media, Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn appear to be the issues you're most concerned about, and or the areas of second language acquisition, research, and pedagogy that you seem to be more interested in. These quickies are going to be very short. Well, hopefully short, because yesterday I tried to record 2 or 3, and the shortest I could come up with was 40. And it's understandable. Normally, my workshops are 5, 6 hours, and being Italian and being me, I'm just like a complete actor chatterbox. I just can't stop talking. So I'm going to try and really make a concerted effort today, try and really keep as short as possible. This will be an intro. So what I'm going to do today, I'm just going to talk very briefly about myself, about my journey, how I got from the passionate language students to E.P.I and the language gym and L.A.M and the books that I wrote with Steve Smith that I'm currently writing. The journey started in Italy, where I was just a language graduate and not really sure what to do with my life. So I decided to go to England, where my cousin was working for the local education authority, and said, there are grants for E students willing to train as language teachers, because there's a massive shortage in England. That was the 90s, so things haven't changed much. There's still a massive shortage. At that point, I landed in England, and the only university at that time that was willing to get PGC students was actually Hull, because all the others were pretty much already full, and those were the heydays, when MFL, PGC MFL courses were still quite full. And that experience was shocking for me, because I had to completely change the way I used to see languages, and I used to teach language. I learned languages. It was everything contradicted everything that I had been taught, and everything that I did as a language learner. It just didn't really make much sense. And interesting enough, the part of my PGC that really taught me something was not languages, was actually PE. For some weird reason, when I arrived and they interviewed me, they said, you have to do 2 subjects. You can choose between, I don't know, there's that PE, you can do history, English, and I said, well, I'd rather do history and English, to be honest, because I'm trained for those. And they said, no, actually, on second thoughts, you being Italian, you can't really teach English. You know what, you're going to teach PE. And that was a bit of a shock for me, because I thought, oh my God, that's going to be a real challenge. In Italy, we don't know anything about cricket, about netball, about rugby, about rounders, absolutely unknown sports. And that actually eventually ended up being the best things that ever happened to me. Why? Because when I was doing my PGC MFL sessions, MFL, by the way, for those of you who are not from the UK, MFL means world languages or modern languages in other countries. And in my ML modern language lessons, all I had to do basically, I had to listen to somebody talking to me about black boxes, language acquisition devices, affective filters, extremely vague concepts, absolutely unsupported by science. And the teaching sequences that I was shown were basically predetermined and fixed, and didn't really have a rationale behind them, apart from the fact the kids had to talk to each other. So they were doing some role plays, well, first flashcards, loads of flashcards, single words. Then they had to basically perform some sort of role play. Listening, reading was minimal, 1 or 2 reading, listening comprehensions. At the end of the lesson, there had to be some productive activity, like, I don't know, writing or doing a little presentation. And what was really interesting and shocking for me coming from Italy is the kids didn't seem to particularly be passionate about languages. The teachers seems, a lot of them, demotivated, stressed, and what they were saying to me is that when they got to year 10, which in England basically is the beginning of the GCSE course, these kids have to be retaught completely, absolutely everything they learned so far. And that to me was kind of demoralizing. On the other hand, when I did my PGC course for in PE, in physical education, it was a completely different world. Whereas in languages, I wasn't given principles or a pedagogical framework for teaching. These PE teachers had a very clear framework. They were told that for every single sport that they were teaching, whether it was football, whether it was basketball, netball, rounders, long jump, athletics, they were given a clear message. You need to identify every single skill and sub-skill involved in the sport. And before you go and play the match, you need to ensure that the students are fluent in every single one of those sub-skills. So if it was football, my lessons would have to state clearly my objectives, which was, for instance, I don't know, focus on passing or shooting or dribbling. And I was supposed to model extensively all of those skills to my students before they would venture into something more complex. And then I would start with passing, and then it was passing from a static position. Then it was passing from a more from while they were running, or passing and then shooting. So in other words, I'm trying to fix my my timer, and that was really refreshing for me because I felt empowered. Whereas every single time as a PGC student, I had to sit down for hours figuring out what to do, and unless I just follow the textbook, which I really felt was they're absolutely useless. So there was this book called Métro that I never seen before, which was absolutely awful. I remember it was just absolutely uninspiring. The listenings were either too easy or too difficult. And in the end, of course, I managed to pass both courses. But what stayed in my mind was, why is it that these kids are actually learning all those skills, whereas in languages, it all feels so random. When I went to my first school in Bedford, it was a very challenging school, like really, really challenging school. On the council estate, I got my tire slashed about 3 or 4 times, I think, in the first year. I realized that it wasn't just me. Every other teacher felt very much like that. Even the most structured, my German head of faculty, when you asked her why she was doing things, why she was doing the listening comprehension or that writing test, the answer was, oh, because I need to test them, or because you're supposed to hit all 4 skills in a lesson, which to me seemed a bit weird because, having been an uncle, having been a cousin of very little kids, I'd seen how many hours of input these kids were getting from their parents, from their entourage, before they started to speak. And I felt that very often, these kids were thrown in the deep end without having had really any substantive modeling through listening and reading. So after 2 years, I learned loads in that school in terms of classroom management, but I also saw kids getting to GCSE being basically unable to answer the most basic questions. I've seen teachers, including myself, forced to teach perfect tense, future tense, hundreds of times until the kids were absolutely bored of it, because he would teach it first in year 8, then in year 9, then again in year 10, then in loads of revision sessions in year 11. Learning wasn't durable, motivation wasn't there. Kids found learning really difficult. In the end, I decided, that's it, I need to learn why I'm doing things, how I can teach more effectively. And I looked at the EFL world, teaching as a foreign language, English as a foreign language. Why? Because that's a business-driven industry. And I had friends who were teaching EFL in abroad, and I could see from their books and the resources they shared with me that it was a completely different way of teaching. And being business driven, they had to deliver results, because if you don't deliver results, you're screwed. Your organization fails, you don't get paid. Whereas when in a state school, in a secondary school, even a private school, let's face it, what is the worst that can happen to you as a teacher if you're not effective? Yeah. And this made me think a lot about you know, what what really was wrong about the MFL world as compared to the EFL world. These people seem to know what they were doing. So I did an MA in TEFL, Reading University, which is basically an MA in applied linguistics. And on this master's, my horizon suddenly expanded. In about 9 months. I was a different teacher altogether. Why? Because suddenly I was learning how the brain learns. I was learning about cognitive psychology, how the brain, and this was back in the 90s. So imagine how much more I would have learned if I followed a course like that, like now in 2019. I started to learn things about vocabulary acquisitions, about fluency, about task-based learning, and this affected me massively. I was just, it was the end of the course. I was itching to go back to teaching, and I was offered a post at Reading University teaching Italian, and then I started to experiment with adults, young adults, 19 to 22, sometimes mature students, or even much older. That gave me an amazing opportunity, because it was pretty low stake for me. In the first 3 years, there's no examinations really. I was left very much to my own devices, which was good. So I could do whatever I actually wanted as far as the kids learned. There were no Ofsted, no inspections, but I also understood the massive difference, the massive gap between universities and high schools or secondary schools, and how they don't really communicate much. They do these days, but in those days they didn't at all. And how different it was. You know, if you were an A-level student going to university, you would be learning languages in a completely different way by teachers who teach using a grammar translation approach, whereas in secondary there was much of a pseudo-communicative approach, and of course it's all literary based at university, whereas a secondary school is completely not. So it was actually very good for me to understand the big gap that exists between tertiary education, university level, and secondary school, and that's a gap that I don't think has still been bridged, and it's very important that it starts being bridged, because otherwise fewer and fewer students will go to university, and that's why so many language departments are closing around the world. After that, I felt nostalgic. After teaching 3-4 years university, I missed teaching kids, you know, something that I would have never thought before. And because I'd experimented so much, and I had done so much, I was really itching to go back and experiment with younger students. And before I left, I decided to undertake a PhD with Professor Macker, who was still at Reading. It was in his last year at Reading University before he moved to Oxford University to become the director of the Department of Modern Languages there, the Department of Education at Oxford University and Norham Gardens. And this guy said, he talked to me about learning strategies, metacognition, and opened a new world to me. And so I did a PhD under his supervision. I was examined by Professor Graham, another big name in the on the English scene, and another world opened to me. And because this time I needed to investigate writing, I needed to investigate the cognition of writing, I needed to investigate metacognition, and my study was a combination of both, seeing how metacognition could affect students' ability to self-monitor, to learn from their mistakes, from their strengths and from their weaknesses. And it was geared towards essay writing. So you can see a lot of different areas of research at play there. And the most important thing I had to learn on my PhD was skill theory. How that is the brain automatizing skills in order to become fluent at something. And suddenly I clicked, because that for me was the missing link. What on my PGCE training I learned in PE, that is that before the kids are ready for the big match, like playing football in the field, team against team, what approach was working in PE, I could actually apply to language learning. Because now I learned that in speaking, listening, writing, reading, and this was like 25, nearly 30 years ago, I learned that there were such skills that have been identified by researchers. So just like we train students in that, how about we did the same in language learning? For instance, teaching skills like in listening, working at the syntactic level, identifying the function that words have in sentence. What I learned later on was called functional processing, or identifying sounds, what we call phonological processing, or identify syllables, or being able to retrieve vocabulary in real time. So the idea was deconstructing each macro skills, identifying the sub skills like you would do for football, long jump, or basketball, and teaching them one by one. And that was the birth of my listening as modeling approach, well before I read John Field in 2008. 2008 was a big eye-opener for me, because John Field's work gave me the structure, gave me the coherence and the scientific validation for what I started already. And why did I start L.A.M? Because I was working in a very, very deprived school with extremely challenging kids. That was the highest teenage pregnancy amongst children aged between 10 and 11. I needed to, I was fed up with these textbooks and this way of teaching, which was totally elitist, which excluded masses of kids. And I decided instead to try a more inclusive approach. I tried, and it was working. It was mostly based on listening and speaking, on chunks, and all the rest that you will be familiar with if you read my book, Breaking the Sound Barrier, or if you are familiar with my blog called The Language Gym, as you might know. After that experience in this very challenging school, I worked in a rural school, which was mixed. It had some travelers, some nomads, some very challenging kids, and some middle upper class kids as well. It was an interesting mix, because you might have 20 kids who were quite well behaved and ambitious. You might have 10 who would, throw a chair at you anytime, or they would call you names, all sort of things. So that was also quite challenging, and it was very good because I improved my classroom management skills. But importantly, I learned how to cope with these two different levels of children in the same class, not by differentiating, but by using a method which was inclusive and made everyone happy. All the staples of L.A.M and E.P.I that I talk about in my workshops. Then I moved to a school in Malaysia, a private school, international school, and different challenges, because it was a very inclusive school. You would have the real high flyers from top like academic ability, and very challenged kids with serious educational special needs, like autism or spectrum related disorders. That was another challenge. It was great, and that's where I started to refine my approach. I was very, very much working solo. One of the challenges of changing approach was that many of my colleagues were not on the same page. I had some colleagues who ripped apart my resources in my meeting. Or people, no, that's not the way you teach. That's the way you teach. No speaking, not much listening, was all writing and reading. And then, of course, the iPad arrived, and then you had people suddenly doing inquiry-based learning with languages, with beginners or beginners or intermediate students who were not ready for um, this sort of level of challenge. Things like smashing apps and videos. Like one of my colleagues was obsessed with it. All you would have is students doing projects on the iPad and complaining to me. In those days, head of French, they were learning nothing. So I had to create my own website so that I could justify using the iPad, and I created the language gym with the concept of recycling, interleaving. Back in the days, not because I was ahead of my time, but because I was doing what I was taught on my MA TEFL. And fun enough, nowadays these things are fashionable, like super trendy on Twitter. Education is talking about retrieval, fluent retrieval, interleaving, retrieval practice. This has been around for 30, 40 years at least. I was learning about that from Professor Tonkin and Reading University, or Professor Weir. So it's nothing new. And I implemented that in the language gym as well as in my worksheets. And then my worksheets were posted on the TS in 2013, I think, 2014. Suddenly, I started to receive accolades from all over the world. I won the TS Best Contributor Award. And finally, people in my department and in my school started to listen, because this guy got the award. Then I published my book, The Language Teacher Toolkit. And finally, it took that to get people on board and start working on E.P.I, which is now in my former school, Garden International School, is used by people like Dylan Viñales, Roland Josekel, and the department, the head of department, Tom Ball, has been very instrumental in ensuring that E.P.I was pursued further at all levels, primary and secondary. And this has been a very difficult journey, of course, because not everyone was on board. I remember, for instance, when I started talking about my ideas on the media, and a very prominent person in the ALL organization kicked me out of my Facebook group because I was talking about those ideas. After maybe 12, 13 years at Garden International School, I decided to leave, to have a temporary break, because I wanted to spread my ideas, my methodology, E.P.I, which I'd been trying out and experimenting with for 14 years. And at that point, I said to Steve Smith, why don't we write a book about it? And Steve Smith was absolutely not into that sort of stuff. He found some of the L.A.M activities boring. He told me that it was not his style of teaching. He wasn't. He was very much into the sort of storytelling or comprehensible input a la Krashen kind of things. He was a fan of Krashen. He actually wrote his MA thesis about him, and but we decided to write it together anyway, and he was very supportive. And I think now it's come around, because he's talking about my narrow listening and all the other activities that I call L.A.M. And to me, it was one of the greatest satisfaction to have converted Steve Smith to my approach. And now he actually presents on it, which is even better. So it means that he's really bought into it. And this approach is explained in the language gym blogs, in this book called Breaking the Sound Barrier, and I will be talking about aspects of it as well in my CPD quickies. And that's it. There you have it. This is the end of my journey. That's where I am now. Currently, launched the Language Gym website, www.language-gym.com, where I applied all of my ideas about recycling and interleaving. I'm going to talk about the rationale behind the Language Gym in a future quickie. This is not a quick anymore. This is already, let me check. Wow, 24 minutes. So I better stop it now. It was a pleasure talking to you. I hope you understand a little bit more about my context, about what I stand for, and I hope that you'll tune in for the next episode, the first real CPD quickie on curriculum design. And all the best. Stay safe, and bye.